everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Stock Market Crash. Hello there. Well, the elections are over and most of the candidates have heard the people's verdict. Old John Q. Public has spoken his piece and it's still echoing up and down the corridors of time, as the poets would have it, and it appears that the nation has decided to do a little house cleaning a bit and turn over a few new leaves, as it has found necessary from time to time ever since we began. The machinery of our democratic way of life, and ever since 1932, the expression has had a double meaning. The machinery of our democratic way of life is so put together that every once in a while it's necessary to reshuffle things to keep the grass and the gears meshing. But probably no upheaval had a greater effect on the nation's politics than the occurrence of the last days of October 1929. If you lived on Grays Harbor in that tempestuous era, no one will need to remind you of the upheaval that changed the nation's life almost overnight, and still make some of the residents set their teeth and get a harried look in their eyes when you mention the year 1929. It was not the local situation. In fact, Grays Harbor only echoed the eruption that started on New York's Wall Street and blasted into every nook and cranny of the nation. But the echo that was heard and felt on Grays Harbor was a little more personal and a little closer than most of the others. So we're going to examine it this evening on the pages of our scrapbook. When George has taken his customary few seconds for our sponsor, we'll open the scrapbook to a page marked October 1929 and find a yarn that was a few chuckles in it, but a lot of fundamental facts that we need to remind us about once in a while. And now, George, some words from our sponsor. Grays Harbor was introduced to one of the phenomenon of the times long before October 1929 rolled around. It was the bucket shop, the pocket-sized stock market where small-town investors could dabble in shares, play the market, and follow the happenings on the New York Stock Exchange over the ticker that spewed tape out of its glass maw at a furious rate. The bucket shop was in the Finch Building, and when it began its career of public service, it was called Anderson Wilson Company, and H.C. Wilson was its manager. It was nothing very mysterious, just a large room with blackboards carried the chalk-up reactions of the stock market at a pace changed with the pace in the New York Stock Exchange, as though the little office in the downtown Aberdeen and the big house in New York were Siamese twins. In fact, it was about like the average stockbroker's office today in a big city. But it was a major operation in a small town in 1929. In March of that year, more than 1,000 Grays Harbor people, men and women, were following the ticker avidly and buying and selling in a fast-moving crystal ball sort of way, with capital ranging from $200 to an estimated $12 million. Some of the Grays Harbor folks who bought and sold through the bucket shop were paying for their shares and covering their margins with incomes of the barber shop or their bellhopping tips, and others were financing their play with a backlog of some big industries. One of Aberdeen's operators was called one of the Big Ten of the Pacific Coast. He bought 1,000 shares in a block and made or lost thousands in a click of a ticker. People who had never heard of stocks except as something in the family trunk that had been purchased from the Wildcat gold mine promoter or some oil speculator were thoroughly familiar with General Motors, Radio, Standard Oil of New York, Continental Motors, Warner Brothers Pictures, City Service, U.S. Steel, and many others. They watched the chalk marks on the blackboard, and the bucket shop watched the chalk marks in Seattle, and Seattle watched chalk marks that went up on the board in the big city exchanges. Moreover, the familiarity with the change in financial picture of the world gave many Grays Harbor citizens a vocabulary for discussing the money problems of the day. It was not uncommon for local financiers to quote in the financial column of the daily press as noting a trend in world finance. In fact, a well-known local figure put his thumb in the armholes of his vest in March 1929 and noted between chomps and his cigar that the high money rates prevailing were an indication of the world's financial sickness. Probably he didn't believe what he said, and the chance is 10 to 1 that it was something he had heard someone else say, but it sounded good. And he had understood his own statement and been able to see what it would eventually lead to. He might have trembled at the sound of his own words. Anyhow, Grays Harbor breezed merrily along through 1929. Jim Riley announced his candidacy for mayor. A grand jury was called in Montesano to examine the lawlessness of Grays Harbor County, and there was much shuffling of the feet in some quarters while the jury looked over the records of some public office holders. The George J. Wolfe Company observed its 32nd anniversary, and this time in its new building on Broadway, Hollis B. Fultz, Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, announced that the harbor was to have a new chair factory, and in Seattle, Enoch Bagshaw resigned as the Husky football coach. A $100,000 addition was started to the Morick Motel, and up and down Heron Street and Simpson Avenue, there was an aura of big business. In midsummer, the bucket shop changed its name to the Anderson Fox Company as Wilson got out. Whether it was his time is not a matter of record. Anyhow, Wendell Hemphill moved to Aberdeen as the new manager of the local stock exchange, and the blackboard continued to record the fluctuation of the eastern stock market. The lumber market was slow in the early fall of 1929, but everyone predicted that there would be a heavy offshore buy later on. And the big Japanese tramps continued to slide into the harbor, take on their loads of Japanese squares, and head west again. And the new pulp mill was employing men, and the harbor plywood plant had rebuilt after the disastrous fire. No one could see anything but good times ahead. So when the stock market had a flurry early in October, the 1,000 Grays Harborites who had been making it their hobby rushed to the Finch building to get in on the kill. Some stocks were fluctuating heavily, and there were figures on the board that represented what the investors called real bargains. The financial column reported unusually heavy buying by people who had never bought before. It was contagious. New faces would appear and new names would buy 10 shares today, make $10, and come back the next day and buy 20 shares. Stocks, the specialist stated, were well below normal, and now was the time to buy. And when they went back to normal, you could ride the wave to fortune. Quick money, easy money. Hemphill told the press that the buying was half speculation and half investment. Whatever it was, it began to build towards a climax. On October 24th, as traders began to liquidate their investments, trading reached an all-time high. That was not only in the New York's widely careening exchange, but in Grays Harbor's little bucket shop, where the blackboards were changed completely in half an hour's time. New records were set every day from coast to coast. Totals turned over, and Grays Harbor turned over its share. All-time turnover records were set. Such veteran traders as Ed Dolan tried to make sense out of the widely changing financial complexion of the market, then bought heavily. As the end of the month neared, Hemphill announced that Grays Harbor investors had purchased more than $1 million worth of stocks during the month. And then came the 30th of October. The market went crazy. Not only was it headlines in the financial columns, it was headlines for papers from coast to coast. The market broke and the prices spiraled down. Investors looked at each other. There had never been anything like it, and they turned to Washington for an explanation. The official announcement came from the national capital was to the effect that the market had crashed. It was almost certain to prove a great help to business. In New York, financial experts picked themselves up off the floor of the exchange and predicted that business would be unhurt by the market's collapse. And on Grays Harbor, the cities turned to their financial leaders. A poll of Anderson and Hoquiam bankers and merchants produced a startling prophecy. The nation will be affected, but the final effects will be to stimulate business. W.H. Tucker, president of the Grays Harbor National Bank, cleared his throat and predicted that the crash would result in lower interest rates and good business. Building, he said, will speed up. The losses are only paper losses. Charles Albertson, president of the First National Bank of Aberdeen, tapped his desk with the point of his letter opener and saw business better than ever. The money will come back to business channels where it belongs, he prophesied. W.E. Lamoureux, vice president of the American National Bank, had just taken office in the new Becker building, observed that the benefits would be obvious more than offset the losses. To most of the residents of Grays Harbor, the events of the last days of October 1929 had little significance. That is, on the first days of November. True, they read of a few Wall Street financiers throwing themselves out of New York office buildings, but the crash that shattered the nation's economy was only the end of a great game that Grays Harbor watched with interest in weeks that followed October 30th. The bucket shop struggled for a while, but people with burned fingers didn't want to play. And finally, it closed, bringing an end to an era. Now, George, a few words from our sponsor. The full significance of those last days of October 1929 came to Grays Harbor when the lumber market, already in a slump, went down still further. And finally, the bottom dropped out completely. Payrolls all stopped. Children were hungry. People began to forsake this place in which they lived. Others came home. The Great Depression had come, and nowhere did it hit more force than in the Pacific Northwest. We won't bring back the story of those years, its forgotten man, its personal tragedies. It was common talk that Grays Harbor was done forever. But how wrong they were. Just as the nation weathered it, so the harbor came through to a new era of growth and expansion, and new horizons of permanency and a future. But the days of October 1929 grew insignificant for all to remember, as such as we record tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.